Do you, like many artists, find drawing trees particularly difficult for some reason? If so, understanding why trees might be so difficult a subject for you to draw could hold the key to changing this completely for you. I want to present 6 reasons why drawing trees might be difficult for you, and one or more of them may be why you struggle to draw trees with the same level of drawing skill as the other parts of your scene. Now, the last 2 points are really important, but the first 4 lead up to them in certain ways, so it's best to hear them all. And at the end, there's a bonus technique tip for when you are drawing trees. So don't miss that. And if you'd like my teaching on how to draw trees, then during that bonus tip, there'll be a link to my Drawing Trees playlist at the end as well. So don't miss that and the videos where I actually step through my method, my thinking, my technique for drawing trees. So, what's the first point? Well, the first point is really just a misunderstanding. For some reason, we thought that drawing trees was going to be easy, or at least easier than the other things we draw. When we think of drawing a face, if we don't get everything right, if the eyes don't line up, if the eyeballs don't line up, if the nose isn't in the right place, then our face isn't going to look quite right. In fact, it may look disturbingly wrong because we have such an exact knowledge of how faces look because we've been observing them so intently our entire life. So they're a really tough object to draw. When we think of drawing a building, if we don't get the proportions correct, if we don't get the perspective correct, well, it just doesn't look quite right, does it? So buildings can be tough subjects. But trees are all different shapes, outlines, sizes. Even the same species of tree can look very different in different examples of the same type. So if the tree I draw is lopsided, a bit tall, a bit short, a bit fuzzy, a bit bare, a bit too dense, then my reference no one will ever know and it will still look like a tree. So unlike faces, people, animals, buildings, trees are friendly subjects. They give me a little more flexibility in what I draw and can still look great. And that's absolutely true, but only up to a certain point. Because the truth that trees do give us more flexibility in the exactness of our representation of what we draw to our reference has given us a false sense of security. It's misled us into being mentally relaxed perhaps with how we draw them, thinking that compared to other subjects, they're actually going to be easier to draw, take less effort to draw, be faster to draw. And then we feel confused and frustrated when we don't experience this in our drawing. In fact, when trees often become the weakest part of our drawing and actually start to detract from the level of skill we've used in our people, our faces, our animals, and our buildings. Because it is just not true that trees are easier to draw. And the fact that we, for all sorts of reasons, have thought that they would be has actually set us up to fail. It has sabotaged our tree drawing efforts. Ironically, it's possibly made trees harder to draw than the other so-called harder subjects that I'm drawing. And this leads me to my second point, which is if we're thinking trees are easier, take less effort, and don't have to be so exact to our reference in our drawing as other subjects, then we won't observe our reference with the same care as we do when we draw people, buildings, cars, etc. Near enough will be good enough will be in the back of our mind. Now, of course, we'll never think this out loud, but it's a subconscious thing. And when we're not drawing from our reference, what we actually draw still has to come from somewhere else, from another part of our experience, our drawing past, our mind, our life, our experiences in some way. And we'll get to what some of those places might be in later points. But if thinking trees will be easier subjects sets us up to fail, then not observing our reference with the same care as other subjects guarantees we will fail. Because unless we want to draw from our imagination, observation is the crucial, foundational first step for every line on the paper that follows, and that includes when we draw trees. And talking of lines brings us to the third point, which is when we feel that trees don't need the same exactness, observation, and commitment as other parts of our drawing, we'll feel that we can go faster when we draw them.
But if we do go faster, it's going to affect our line work, because part of how a line looks on the paper comes from the speed with which it's drawn, both its accuracy and its appearance.
So drawing one part of our drawing with a faster, less observed technique will actually produce a different looking line to some extent than the line work in the rest of our drawing. When we draw, every line needs to be drawn with the same care and intent as every other line, regardless of the subject, because this is what will give our whole drawing a stylistic, a visual cohesion from all the parts within it that make it up.
Otherwise, the line work of our tree will look different from the line work of the rest of the drawing, and it will stand out in some way, and not in a good way. I know that if a large tree takes up half the space in my reference, then it's going to take me at least half the time I spend drawing to draw that tree, possibly more, because trees often involve more line work than, say, buildings. And if I don't feel I have the patience to give the time and commitment to drawing that tree at that moment, then I should choose another subject.
Our next reason for why trees are so difficult to draw goes back to our childhood, because trees are usually a very common and important part of our experience of life as a child, both as a backdrop to what we're doing, but also something we might climb or play with or play under. And because of this, they feature very early in children's drawings and very frequently. And part of the way children usually draw and learn to draw is to simplify what they're drawing, mostly done by adopting a symbol for the object, a symbol they usually get from other older children. You've probably heard children say, "How do you draw a cat?" And what they really mean is, what's the symbol? What's the way we represent a cat in a drawing? And so our first drawing of a tree is usually a tree symbol. That's how we start when we think about trees and drawing. And I think that for some people, for some reason, the symbol that's used in childhood for tree, whether it's the simple lollipop form or a somewhat more sophisticated, more realistic approach, linger into the adult drawing experience, somehow start to influence the way trees are observed and drawn into adult life more than the other symbols for stars or flowers or houses do. Of course, I'm not talking about the actual childhood symbols themselves, but the sense that there's a way to draw trees that's somehow different to drawing other things, a shortcut way, a faster way, a "can you tell me how to draw trees" way. Again, this misleads us into not observing properly because we don't think we need to. We just need to learn the way to draw trees. And it makes us blind to the fact that our approach to drawing trees should be exactly the same as our approach to drawing any other subjects. In technique, in style, in observation, identical for every other part of that scene that we're drawing. There is no just for trees special way to do it. This next point is really important. Most drawing is done with line. And let's face it, some subjects lend themselves to being represented with line more easily than others. A box? A good subject to represent with lines. Not such good subject for line. Very difficult subject for line. Because we're drawing with lines, and lines most commonly are used to define edges. And with a box, that's straightforward. But with a tree, whereas the trunks and perhaps some of the branches have a reasonable number of edges, when we come to the leaves, how do we cope with edges for millions of leaves? And what many of us do, and certainly what I see a lot, is that we go back to something of our childhood approach to drawing leaves. It's a bit like this. We start with the lollipop tree. We refine it with a little more sophisticated observation. We reach a point where our tree outline is a little further advanced, and now we're concerned about the leaves. And again, usually from our peers, we pick up that this is a great way to show there are leaves. The squiggly line approach. Now, there is nothing about these lines that in any way links to a realistic representation of a leaf. But what it is it's a symbol. It's a symbol that's quite separate from the symbol for the overall tree shape. This is a symbol for the leaf texture. In effect, it's a pattern to represent leaves. And I see many drawings of trees that look like this leaf pattern has not entirely been let go of. Now, it's a little more sophisticated than what we used as a child, and usually we employ the pattern more heavily in some parts to create a darker effect and to represent something of shadow or shade. But for all that, it really is just still a refinement of something we were doing at an earlier stage. And you might be thinking, well, that looks nothing how I draw leaves. But stop and consider the idea for a moment. Is it that you don't do this, or is it just that you've developed your own particular pattern for drawing leaf texture? And it's just different from this one, but the principle is the same. And part of the problem with this is that patterns generally are a decoration of a two-dimensional surface. And so in our drawings, they do tend to flatten the shape of the tree rather than to suggest the roundness, the depth, the three-dimensionality, which is such an important part of certainly any large tree and large tree canopy. So focusing with line as a means of copying edges and defining shapes through edges really is an unworkable approach when it comes to trees in lots of ways. And I think that's why it can cause us to linger with some earlier approaches for drawing trees that we otherwise would have moved away from. Now, in a moment, I've got a great tree drawing technique tip for you, and a link to my drawing tree playlist will appear as well. But before that, my final reason why trees can be so difficult to draw is we become overwhelmed by the sheer detail of the parts of them. Most obviously, by the millions and millions of leaves. We often think of drawing as representing shapes, and of course this happens easily when we're drawing with line, rather than in our drawing representing the effect of the shapes, rather than the exactness of the shapes. Because when enough very small shapes are massed together, we no longer see any one. What we see is the overall effect of all of these shapes. And of course, this is just as useful an approach for any subject where there is a mass of very small detail. I use it constantly in my architectural drawings. On large-scale buildings, where the detail, particularly as it goes into the distance, becomes as impossible to draw as leaves on a tree. But where I still want to represent, still want to create the effect of that detail somehow. For me, this focus came from painting large Australian trees in oil paint for 10 years before I did any drawing of them at all. Because with paint, line is not so important, because we work with blocks of colour and various tonal values as well as with shape and line. We're painting overall form more often than shape. If you like, we're representing three-dimensional form rather than two-dimensional shape. And so this became my focus that I consciously adopted in my line work when I began to draw trees, to capture the effect of the three-dimensional form rather than the outline two-dimensional shape. So this is the approach I've used in all the trees you've seen me draw in this video and in all the trees you've seen me draw in all of my YouTube videos. Instead of using lines to somehow represent the shapes of leaves, I use lines to try and capture the effect of all of the leaves massed together, which means I'm usually trying to draw the three-dimensional form more defined by the light and by the scale of the tree than by any of the individual leaves. If this isn't a technique you've tried, why not give it a go, especially if you're not happy with how your trees look at this point. So what's this quick tree drawing tip that I've got for you now? We have here 3 identical tree skeletons. And in our 3 trees that were pretty identical, we've put in some line work to describe those canopies more. My question is, which of these 3 trees looks the smallest and which of these 3 trees looks like it could be the largest? In general terms, we would have to say that tree number 1 looks the smallest tree because we can see the individual leaves, and the fact that we can see them quite large in comparison to the trunk seems to say to us that the tree's not very large and or we're quite close to it. Tree number 3 is the most opposite of that. These marks don't really indicate leaves, they're just little flecks and specks. What they do more is indicate the effect of a tree canopy seen from a great distance. So we see this perhaps as a very tall, an enormous tree in fact. The tree in the middle seems to be larger than the first one, but quite a lot smaller than this one. If my marks create an outline that could be interpreted as an individual leaf, my brain will seize on that to create a sense of scale. When I was painting those gum trees, the challenge was not to put any brush strokes on the canvas that could do the same thing. The challenge when we draw is to make sure that our marks never suggest an individual leaf unless we're drawing them with an intent and at a scale for the overall size of the tree that we're doing it deliberately. Otherwise, what usually happens is we make our big trees seem a lot smaller and have a lot less impact than possibly they deserve. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I live in a place where I'm surrounded by trees, and you've probably guessed by now that I love them. So I hope you have as much fun drawing them as I do. I'll see you next time. Bye.